What's going on, everybody? Bobby O'Brien here. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how to optimize the function of insulin, the most important factor for weight loss, and how you can do it day in and day out in a very simplistic way to see the number on the scale go down each and every week. Sometimes, for some of my clients, the weight will go down progressively each and every day. So, if you would like to do that, and if you'd like to do it in more of a personalized way, feel free to message me on Instagram at It's Bobby O'Brien, and we can start mapping out a plan for you. And feel free to book in a call if you'd like to get started right away, and I can fully map out that program for you. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to go over each macronutrient, fat, protein, and carbohydrates, and the insulin response that you get from each one of these macronutrients, how it's nuanced in different ways for each one, and how you can apply this information into your diet so that you can start seeing results right now. So we're going to start with fat. Dietary fat does not formulate an insulin response at all whatsoever. You heard that right. So saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, the two best forms of fat, do not formulate an insulin response at all whatsoever. So once again, what is insulin and why is insulin important? Insulin is an anabolic hormone that is produced by the pancreas in the beta cells. What does anabolic mean? Anabolic is basically simplistically known as a growth hormone. It's a term that means growth. So insulin is responsible for the growth of the fat cell. It is also responsible for the storage of different nutrients inside the muscle. So that's why you get a postprandial insulin release whenever you eat protein, because that's what's happening. Insulin storing those essential amino acids into the muscle. We're going to cover that here in a second. We'll stay on fat. But knowing that insulin can actually store glucose into the fat cell and actually allow you to put on more and more body fat, knowing that fat doesn't formulate an insulin response at all whatsoever is amazing. And that's exactly what we want to optimize for. We want to optimize the function of insulin. So what does an optimal insulin response look like? Well, it is good if you don't get any insulin response at all whatsoever, but what would be great as well if you are going to get some sort of an insulin response is seeing insulin go up, but then going back down just as fast as it came up. Now, when it gets really bad is when you see insulin go up very high and it goes down very slowly, staying elevated for quite some time. So the longer insulin stays elevated for, the probability of your chances basically of putting on body fat goes through the roof whenever insulin stays elevated for a long period of time. And it makes sense because this hormone, when stimulated by processed forms of carbohydrates and sugars, which we'll cover as well, that's exactly what happens. Insulin spikes up very high, and it takes a really long time for that hormone to go back down to an adequate level. And it makes sense if it's coming from an artificial source, something that's kind of foreign to the body, foods that we haven't really been consuming that really long at all in human history, especially seed oils, which is about 200 years. So I digress. We'll go back to fat. Monounsaturated and saturated fat, those two fat sources are going to give you really good, or pretty much no insulin response at all whatsoever. That's why a lot of my clients eat a whole lot in the way of dietary fat from fattier cuts of fish, fatty red meat, and on top of that too, you're getting a whole lot in the way of fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A, D, E, and K2, otherwise known as choline. And feel free to check out my video too, where I break down saturated fat, why it's healthy, and why you don't need to avoid it, as well as a plethora of randomized controlled trials that show that even in 8 years of randomized controlled data in humans, even though total cholesterol goes up from saturated fat intake, mortality is unchanged. So going back to insulin, saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, you do not get an insulin response. But what about protein? Protein is a little bit more complicated. It's a building block macronutrient, so it is also responsible for growth like insulin. And insulin is released to a certain extent. You will see a postprandial initial insulin response whenever you do consume some protein because it is anabolic. It's going to induce some growth, and usually it's going to be in the way of beneficial growth, such as adding more muscle mass to your body. And if you're eating protein from an animal source, which I would highly recommend because it's going to have all 9 essential amino acids, they're going to help you induce muscle protein synthesis, having the big 3, valine, leucine, and isoleucine. That's what's really going to cause that insulin response, because insulin has to therefore shuttle that over into the muscles to induce that muscle protein synthesis to allow the muscles to grow. And that is a good thing if you are looking to lose weight, because not only increase your metabolic rate by doing so, but you increase what's called insulin sensitivity, which is insulin being a little bit more sensitive to the glucose and any other substrates that come into your body, so it can therefore utilize it in a better fashion. And that is definitely a good thing. And you can basically think of muscle as like your metabolic sponge. And the bigger your muscle is, or your muscles, right? Legs, chest, back, whatever example you like to use, the bigger those muscles are, the bigger the sponge becomes. And it can soak up more and more glucose and continue to boost your metabolic rate, because the demand for fuel is now going to go up with a higher level of muscle mass. So that's why I would recommend eating protein from animal sources, so you can get those 9 essential amino acids to induce that muscle protein synthesis and see the benefits of adding more muscle mass to your body. Of course, you want to be doing some weight training with that if you want to see the full benefit of that. So now we're going to move on to carbohydrates, which is a little bit more nuanced. Simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are more of like a fast absorbing carbohydrate source, really mainly being fruits, and complex carbohydrates are more of a slow absorbing carbohydrates, mainly being vegetables. Simple carbohydrates like fruits have a little bit more in the way of fructose and glucose. That's why they're a little bit sweeter. They're naturally occurring fruit sugars, but for somebody who's hyperinsulinemic, where they may be dealing with some insulin resistance, or they're type 2 diabetic, it may not be the best idea for them to be eating a copious amounts of carbohydrates from fruits every single day, because you will get a stronger initial insulin release whenever you do eat naturally sourced carbohydrates from fruits, because it's going to have more in the way of those fruit sugars, such as fructose and glucose, right? Fructose and glucose is still present in certain vegetables. Some have more, some have less, but the majority of these vegetables that are a little bit more low glycemic, meaning that it's not going to really spike your blood glucose that high, are going to have less in the way of those fruit sugars, or those, those monosaccharides, right? Fructose and glucose, naturally occurring fruit sugar. So that's why vegetables, complex carbohydrates, are a little bit better for somebody who is dealing with insulin resistance, somebody who is hyperinsulinemic, and somebody who is trying to lose a whole lot in the way of weight and not very metabolically healthy, because they don't have to worry about getting their insulin hormone fully stimulated, or as stimulated as much as they would see from simple fruits, right? Simple carbohydrates. So that's what I would prioritize if you're that person. If you're somebody that is, looking to lose more of a smaller amount of weight, maybe around 10 to 15 pounds, maybe you wouldn't have to do that. I have many clients that we transition them from a lower carbohydrate diet to certainly a more of a moderate carbohydrate diet, where they're consuming anywhere between 100 to 200 grams of carbohydrates per day, and they still lose weight consistently. But that's why it is a personalized approach that I take, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach where I just throw some cookie-cutter plan at them. We make sure that it's a diet that they can do and see results in right from the beginning. So if it is a lower carbohydrate diet, we will do that and then transition. If it's a little bit more of a moderate carbohydrate diet, we can do that as well. So processed sugars and processed carbohydrates, that's whenever you will start to see very negative initial insulin responses, where you actually will see insulin go up and stay elevated for a long period of time. And we certainly don't want that, right? Back to the analogy that we talked about earlier, you will either see, when it comes to just insulin responses in general, kind of ignoring fat for a minute, because that's, fat is an exception, there's no insulin response. If we're looking at naturally sourced food, naturally sourced fruit and vegetables, naturally sourced carbohydrates versus processed carbohydrates, you're going to get one of two insulin responses, right? You'll either see insulin go up and go back down just as fast as it came up, or with the processed carbohydrates, you'll see insulin go up very high, much higher than the simple carbohydrate example, and you'll see it go back down very slowly, so it stays elevated for a very long period of time. So the probability of you putting on body fat is also very high. So that's why whenever we craft out, a foods to eat and foods to avoid list with lists of options and things to exclude, usually those are some of the things that they would exclude from their diet. Things that are going to give off a very negative initial insulin response. I mean, that's easy, right? Everyone knows that brownies, ice cream, and junk, processed carbohydrates and sugars are not going to give you a very, good insulin response, and may not be very healthy for you. But there's a lot of other things too that people don't know about, that I don't have time to cover in this video, that my clients do know about though, that will give them initial insulin response that's definitely not very good. will spike their insulin through the roof, and it will stay elevated for some time. And we are sure to eliminate those foods from their diet. So everything that they're eating inside of each meal is basically loving them back. They're getting a good hormonal response. So they're basically losing weight with each and every meal without having to count or restrict a single calorie. So once again, if this is something that you would like to do, message me on Instagram at It's Bobby O'Brien. If you'd like to book a call, feel free to click the link in the description below, where I'll basically fully customize the program for you. We can get started right away and not waste each other's time. We go ahead and just get started right here, right now, so you can see results as soon as possible. So you're more than welcome to do that. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments or message me over at Instagram, and I will see you in the next video.